Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, the Cuban embargo has been in effect for over 60 years and has lasted through 13 different presidents, starting from President Dwight Eisenhower. Is it time to end the embargo? Dr. Jorge Duany is the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. He is the author of several books, and his latest book is Cuba and Puerto Rico, Transdisciplinary Approaches to History, Literature, and Culture. And he joins me today from Miami. Dr. Duany, the Cuban embargo has been in place for over 60 years and through 13 different presidents. Organizations like the Washington Office of Latin America say that the policy has failed. Do you agree?
Not achieve its purpose, meaning a change of regime in the Cuban government. Uh, but then the opinion as to whether the embargo should be lifted or maintained is more divided. And so the latest poll in 2022 among Cuban Americans found that the majority actually support it. So there's a contradiction there because on the one hand, most people say it doesn't work. On the other hand, say most of them say keep it. So the reason why I think it has remained in place for so long is that despite the fact that there have been so many presidents in office, the relations between Cuba and the United States, except for that brief period of time under the last term of the Obama years, uh, continue to be extremely conflicted. And so the United States has insisted that Cuba make a number of changes, for example, in questions of human rights and free elections and the treatment of political prisoners, which the Cuban government has not wanted to make. And also there are pending issues like the embargo and the issue of confiscated properties at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. So for all those reasons, and of course, another major obstacle to normalizing relations is that there's a very strong Cuban American lobby in Washington that tends to support the status quo.
Now, there is a new proposal by Senator Amy Klobuchar, the Bill to Export to Cuba Act, and that has supported right now about four different senators, both Republican and senators, and Democrats rather. But it is going to be opposed by Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Menendez. Now, let me ask you this. It seems as though people they go back and forth because your university had did a poll back in 2016 where a lot of people believed that the embargo had not worked and they wanted to change, but that shifted over time, and it seems as though any move towards normalization has to go through Miami, but then it has to go through people like Senator Marco, who has to lead on this issue, as well as people like Senator Menendez. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I think the fact that there are now 10 Cuban American uh, senators and Congress people suggests that they do have sort of a veto power in Congress, both in the House of Representatives and more importantly, perhaps in the Senate, where many of these bills either move or die out. And certainly the position of those two senators, one Republican and one Democrat, Rubio and Menendez, is critical to any move regarding Cuba. And I might remind you and your audience that, in fact, uh, recently during the State of the Union address by President Biden, there was an informal talk after the talk by President Biden approaching Senator Menendez, and we heard President Biden saying, "We have to talk about Cuba." And now we don't know whether that meeting actually took place or what transpired in it, but certainly the fact that any president and any powerful politician in the U.S. has to take into account the powerful Cuban American electorate, particularly given the fact that Florida, at least until recently, has been a swing state, and that most presidents would have to win in Florida in order to win nationally.
The British statesman Edmund Burke once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a representative owes more to his constituency than his labor, but his wisdom as well. Do you think people like Senator Marco, as well as Senator Menendez, are using their wisdom to help guide the people as to what the policy really should be towards Cuba? Or are they just simply thinking about the next election? And in Florida's case, the 27 electoral votes that's needed for the White House.
I think there's no reason why we should doubt uh, the public statements of these two senators as well as the other eight who all agree on the question of Cuba and the support for a tough policy on Cuban U.S.-Cuba relations unless there is a substantial move in the direction of human rights, democracy, and tolerance of dissidents. Um, so I believe it's a question of principles. And of course, their principles are based on their own experiences, or perhaps, as in the case of Rubio's uh, uh, biography, his parents' experience as exiles from revolutionary Cuba. They clearly care for the Cuban American community, and they have very strong opinions on issues relating to Cuba. And they, of course, do represent the majority opinion, at least as it now stands. Let me go back to that fact that you mentioned, which was that for the first time in 2016, the FIU poll did find that the majority of Cuban Americans at that moment supported lifting the embargo. But then the opinion has shifted back to majority support, especially during the Trump administration.
So, why did that happen? What was the cause of the shift? Is it generational? Is it because of people who were born in Miami or Florida versus being born in Cuba? What was the difference there?
It's hard to tell. My colleague Guillermo Grenier, who is the lead investigator of the FIQ poll, has talked about the Trump factor, which itself has to be explained. So there's a tremendous support for Donald Trump. There was in the first administration, and there continues to be in the last 2022 poll, most Cuban Americans intended to vote for Trump in the next election. So, and of course, Trump has courted the Cuban American electorate, particularly older, more conservative Republican Cuban Americans, with regard to the toughening of sanctions against Cuba during his administration. But also, the poll found that there's a general sympathy among Cuban Americans for many of Trump's policies regarding China, immigration, the economy, even coronavirus, which of course was so controversial during the heyday of the pandemic. So I would say it's mainly the reason why Cuban Americans returned to a hard policy against Cuba, an isolationist policy rather than an engagement policy, was precisely because they were following the leadership of the White House and particularly the Trump administration.
Now, you've spoken a lot about the protests that was happening in Cuba back in 2021, famous July 11th. What has happened as a result of that? And is that one of the reasons why people, let's say Cubans in America, do say we should maintain the embargo because of the protests that are happening or did happen in Cuba?
Yeah, I think now, almost 2 years after the July 11, 2021 protest, I think we can identify two main results. One of them, of course, was a crackdown by the Cuban government on people who had participated in mostly peaceful demonstrations. More than 1,000 people have been accused of pretty serious crimes, sedition, for example, which is punished severely in Cuban law. And many people are still waiting for a sentence, but clearly the Cuban government does not want that event to repeat itself. And so far, it hasn't. We have seen smaller, more isolated incidents of protests, especially given the fact that Cuba has been experiencing blackouts for the last few months. And occasionally also many of the protesters will explicitly call for freedom and the end of communism and the dictatorship, as they frame it. But certainly, this incident had ripple effects all throughout the Cuban nation as well as the diaspora. And of course, after July 11, there were expressions of solidarity not only here in Miami, but everywhere you had significant numbers of Cubans living outside. And I think that has reawakened the ties, the transnational ties between Cubans on the island and abroad, and particularly pushing for a major change in Cuban politics and the economy.
Mhm. Going back to the embargo for a minute, what has been the effect of the embargo on the Cuban people? We know with COVID and everything that it's had a drastic effect, and the embargo certainly has not helped. When the Soviet Union crashed, the support that Russia gave to Cuba is no longer there. We know about the Venezuelan oil subsidies, that's no longer there. But what has the embargo itself done to the economy of Cuba and the people of Cuba?
I think in a nutshell, the main response has to be that it has made life more difficult for ordinary Cubans, not just for the Cuban government, and it's actually arguable whether the embargo has had the effect of isolating Cuba from other countries and trading partners. In fact, the only country in the world that maintains these kinds of sanctions against Cuba is the US. And so Cuba is able to trade with almost everyone else. But it makes life more difficult and, of course, more expensive for people to buy food and medicine and fuel. And that has been a constant, sorry, throughout the existence of the embargo.
Most countries have condemned the embargo. The United Nations have voted to condemn the embargo for 30 years in a row. And so I bring it back to the original point is where is the new thinking or some kind of different thinking about how to approach a relationship with Cuba from the perspective of the United States? I mean, Jimmy Carter tried when he was president and he lifted some restrictions, and then Ronald Reagan came in and put restrictions back on. And obviously, Obama tried, and then Trump reversed those. But is there a new kind of thinking somewhere about how we should deal with Cuba?
It's hard to answer that question, but I would say that in general, the dominant thinking has been so far, as you have described, the idea that the United States and other countries around the world should put pressure on Cuba to make changes. And so, for example, the existing laws in the United States require major changes in elections, for example, free elections, allowing multiple political parties to compete for popular votes, liberating political prisoners. So there are very difficult conditions to be met in order for any major change, and that is currently the dominant policy. Now, of course, there have always been critics of the idea of maximum pressure, as it was called during the Trump administration, because they don't seem to make the short term or even long term impact that its supporters hold. So, given that sort of dominant position, the sort of different thinking would have been precisely during the brief period 2014 to 16, roughly, when the Obama administration tried a different approach. And the approach was then, of course, that you should normalize relations with Cuba, which the United States did, and still there is a U.S. embassy working in Havana and a Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. But of course, many of those changes were undone by the Trump administration. Now we're kind of in a middle place between the engagement policy during the Obama that only lasted a couple of years and the longstanding policy of various administrations regarding engagement. I mean, isolation, and again, putting in place of economic and political sanctions so that it would make it very difficult for the Cuban government to survive. And at some point, also, there has been talk of using these pressures, for example, restricting travel or investment or financial transactions with Cuba, so that the Cuban government somehow would rise up, given the intolerable living conditions that they're suffering. That, of course, hasn't happened, except, of course, you could argue that July 11 was an exception to the rule, or even a couple of other instances since the 1960s. I'm thinking of the so-called Maleconazo, major street protest in 1994.
Now, the Biden administration has made some changes, hasn't gone as far as his former boss did, President Obama. He has lifted some of the travel restrictions, remunerations, family reunification. Where do you think the Biden administration should go next in terms of trying to normalize those relations, keeping in mind that the 2024 election is upon us?
Yeah. I would characterize the current Biden administration as an intermediate point, sort of a threading a fine line between the Obama engagement policy on the one hand and the Trump administration policy of maximum pressure. And as you know, the moderate changes that the Biden administration has made refer primarily to his campaign promises actually, that he would lift some of the restrictions, travel restrictions by Cuban Americans sending remittances. And also a major change has been to staff the U.S. Embassy in Havana, not at the full size that it was before the pandemic, but certainly grown to the extent that now the United States Embassy is issuing migrant visas and family reunification visas at a level approximately to, 20,000 visas per year, which has been the historic number that both the Cuban and U.S. government had agreed on. Uh, they have not made other changes that would have undermined the embargo. They do not allow, for example, U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba freely, except under certain travel conditions. And they have not allowed U.S. companies, for example, to trade with Cuba, with a couple of exceptions that are significant. And also, I want to add that another change that they have made, which has substantial implications for Cuban Americans, is that Cuban Americans can now travel beyond Havana to several airports. I believe it's 8 airports around the island. And that will make it easier for those who have relatives and connections in those places, rather than try, the old policy was that you could only travel to Havana, and for their own, you had to get somewhere to Santiago, which is
Mm-hmm.
on the other side of the island.
Now, there are some additional issues that are at play. I know when Raul Castro was president, one of the issues he had pressed President Obama on was the return of Guantanamo Bay, which the United States leases. But I don't know if it's mythology or not, but the United States is supposed to pay for the lease. But the word was Castro would take those checks and shove them in the drawer. He never cashed any of those. But that's one of the issues. The other issue is the harboring of alleged fugitives. Case in point, Joanne Chesimard, who is the godmother of the late Tupac Shakur, and United States wants those folks back to be extradited to the United States. Does that play in negotiations with Cuba to normalize relations as well?
Historically, those issues have been at the table, mostly because Cuba, as you put it, insists on including it as part of the negotiations. The United States has traditionally been reluctant to make concessions about those two issues, Guantanamo and issues of fugitives that the United States also considers terrorists in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
On those issues, I doubt that there will be any movement forward, except, of course, that there has been some attempt by first the Obama administration, and I understand also the Biden administration, to close down, if not Guantanamo entirely, the prison that was in place at one point after 9/11, and which had hundreds of enemy combatants, as they were called. Now there are just a few, I think less than 100 of them. So for that perspective, I mean, that clearly was one of the main uses of Guantanamo, because the United States did not want to have those prisoners in the U.S. Mainland. And in fact, Congress has not allowed the closing of the prison in Guantanamo in the past few years uh, because they have to remain in place. Other arguments regarding Guantanamo have to do with the fact that it's a major base, naval base in the Caribbean, and that it serves to protect the southern border, documented immigrants, and drug trafficking are two major concerns. Uh, but really, there's no reason in my mind that the United States could not move forward with negotiating an orderly departure from Guantanamo, as they did, for example, in the Panama Canal Zone, and that seems to be the model in which the United States might retain some rights to use the land in Guantanamo if it is able to agree on principles with the Cuban government. Now, on the Cuban government side, as we mentioned, Fidel Castro was adamant that this was an intrusion on the country's national sovereignty. And I think it remains that kind of intransigent position that the United States has no business in another country, uh, you know, not even mentioning that it's not a friendly country,
Hmm.
country at all. So the Cuban position is that Guantanamo is not a legitimate uh, 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 location for U.S. military activities. But of course, there is that 1903 treaty with the first Republican government in Cuba that makes it look like it's legal.
The president of Cuba, Diaz Canel, how is he doing right now? I mean, if you take into consideration the July 11th protests, the economy is pretty much in shambles right now. But there are support groups for him. In fact, he had garnered enough support of people to come out and have protests against the protesters. So how is he doing right now? And do you think he can survive? And how much longer do you think he can stay as leader of Cuba?
Yeah. Well, the government's staying power is actually quite impressive. I mean, everyone was expecting, for example, Cuba to fall after the fall of the Berlin Wall and disappearance of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. That hasn't happened. It's been 30 years since then. And there doesn't seem to be really any sign that the current government in power, led by Miguel Diaz-Canel and the single party system based on the Cuban Communist Party, is going to crumble anytime soon. However, I think that the first term in office, the first 5 years by Miguel Diaz-Canel were extremely problematic. Among the reasons, of course, the coronavirus pandemic that affected everyone around the world, but especially Cuba, which seems to have done poorly regards to protecting its population. It did develop a number of vaccines, but they came a little late during the pandemic. Then, of course, the hostility by the Trump administration and the increasing of sanctions, all of which, of course, now are expressed in tremendous levels of migration, which had never been, even though Cuba has been an immigration country since 1959. We have never seen the numbers, 300,000 or so in 2022. And that those numbers have apparently decreased this year, but still, there's a tremendous potential for migration, which I think can be interpreted as an expression of discontent and the widespread poverty that clearly yes, Canel has had to manage. And be frank, has not been able to do so. Now, Diaz-Canel has a number of issues that make him quite unpopular in Cuba. In fact, although again, we don't have, there are no surveys of public opinion to talk about in a scientific way, but there are expressions of anti-Diaz-Canel feeling for reasons. First of all, he first ruler of Cuba, who is not a Castro, right? Neither Fidel nor Raúl. Although he's close to Raúl, Raúl actually appointed him and chose him as his successor, but he doesn't have the charisma and he doesn't have the history that the Castro brothers, who fought in the guerrilla fights, guerrilla activities in Sierra Maestra. He is a post-revolutionary figure who's mainly a party member. He's been very loyal to Raúl and to Fidel, and his promise of his mantra actually in the first 5 years, and I guess in the next ones is continuity rather than change, which I think don't really sit well with the majority of the Cuban population because that some change is needed.
So, where do you see this whole situation, let's say 5 years from now, at the end of the next administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, meaning Biden being reelected, where do you see the situation with Cuba being at that point? And you yourself, you're from Cuba. Where do you want it to be, and what do you think needs to happen for there to be a normalization of relations between the two countries?
Yeah, I mean, I can't predict the future, but I can attempt some, reasonable speculation. First of all, I think it's important to expand the diplomatic relations, which I would argue were the major achievement of the Obama administration. Many of the programs that he put in place, the People to People program, have not survived. The tremendous tourist boom that the number of visitors from the United States going to Cuba. I remember the phrase was before it changes, and my reaction to that was that Cuba is always changing, but of course maybe not as quickly and in the direction that people outside of Cuba would want it. Uh, so I think that's a major achievement and should be preserved. It should be expanded. I mean, the normal diplomatic channel through which governments communicate, and there have been modest advances, I think, since the Biden administration took over. So, for example, there have been migration conversations that were suspended before Biden's time, even conversations regarding terrorism and national security. There are a number of other issues that are of common interest: drug trafficking, trafficking in persons, environmental concern. Because after all, Cuba and the United States are neighbors, and they share a border, a sea border between Florida and Cuba. So I would hope that those kinds of contacts would expand and become more regular, so that grievances and perspectives on both sides can be channeled appropriately. During the pre-Obama period, many of these things could not even be talked about at the official level. Now, it's hard to know what will happen after the next elections because, of course, as we mentioned before, the Biden administration doesn't seem to want to make drastic changes in the existing policy, most likely because it's trying to appease the Cuban American vote and trying perhaps, if not to win Florida, at least to sort of not lose Florida by a large margin, which is, again, difficult to predict given the fact that Florida did turn Republican in the last election. But in any case, I would hope again that those kinds of contacts be preserved and strengthened. And in my own experience, I think for people like myself, people of Cuban origin, people who have relatives in Cuba, and who want to keep in touch with them, want to help them send money, travel there as frequently as possible, call them on the phone, send them medicine, etc. I think that's the most important aspect of the relationship between the two countries. That is the human aspect of it. And unfortunately, in my own family and in many other Cuban American families, those kinds of normal family contacts were curtailed for many years. Until 1978, for example, Cuban Americans couldn't travel to Cuba because the Cuban government didn't allow them. And then more recently, because it's been more difficult for Cuban Americans to travel to Cuba.
In the last moment we have, the demographics of the Cuban population is shifting in Florida. You're going to have younger people. Are they going to be at the forefront of ultimately changing what the policy is going to be towards Cuba?
Yeah, the Cuba poll again, which is I think the major source of information on many of these topics, suggests that the major change is not by age, because in fact, younger Cuban Americans, although they do support more engagement with Cuba, are not becoming registered massively as Democrats. So the community as a whole remains majority Republican or Republican leaning. It's the independents that seem to be growing, whereas the Democrats really remain a small minority of the total Cuban American vote. However, we have seen some movement in the past few decades. Younger Cuban Americans, those born in the United States, those who have come on more recently, tend to favor uh, some sort of rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean they support the Cuban government. In fact, the vast majority are not supportive and are very critical. But so far, it doesn't seem to be a sea change in a generational sense, because some of the younger Cuban Americans who are entering politics, for example, actually are as conservative as their parents and grandparents. And on key issues of Cuban U.S. relations, like again human rights, democracy, and the treatment of political prisoners, I don't think there is still a major shift in public opinion here in Miami.
Dr. Jorge Duany has been our guest today on the Aguilar Conversations. Dr. Duany, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to speak to you again real soon about additional changes that might be happening on the island of Cuba. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay. Thank you for joining in this week, and join us again next week as we discuss another topic of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.